August 30th, 1944. A remote road near the Belgian border. It was pitch black. Rain hammered against the canvas roofs of a convoy of United States Army trucks. The vehicles moved fast. They drove too fast for the muddy, narrow roads. The convoy raced west, moving away from the front lines. Their target was a massive supply depot belonging to the United States First Army. The drivers were nervous. Their hands gripped the steering wheels. They did not scan the tree line for German snipers. They did not watch the road for landmines. Instead, they watched for the red armbands of the American military police. These men were not on a standard supply run. They were executing a heist. Preparation had been meticulous. The soldiers had torn the shoulder patches from their uniforms. They had used olive drab paint to cover the Third Army symbols on the truck doors. Every driver carried forged transport papers. These orders came from the very top. General George S. Patton himself had authorized the operation. The mission was simple. Drive to the First Army depot. Pretend to be First Army personnel. Load 500,000 gallons of gasoline. Then, disappear. If the military police stopped them, the result was certain: a court-martial. In the middle of a world war, stealing supplies from your own side was a capital crime. But to Patton, this was not theft, it was survival. His tanks sat silent on the road to Germany. The engines were dry, the fuel gauges pointed to zero. Supreme Headquarters had cut his supply lines. General Dwight D. Eisenhower had made a choice. He diverted the fuel to other commanders. Patton was left with nothing. Why did Patton choose crime over command? At first glance, it was a betrayal of the chain of command. But in reality, it was the only way to keep the offensive alive. Without gasoline, the Third Army was a stationary target. Patton refused to stop. The footage from the era shows the scale of the problem. Long columns of Sherman tanks sit abandoned on dirt roads. Soldiers lean against empty fuel drums. The sound of silence replaced the roar of engines. Events accelerated. Patton decided that if the high command would not give him fuel, he would take it. The trucks reached the depot gates. The drivers held their breath. They handed over the forged documents. The guards looked at the papers. August 29, 1944. The Allied advance hit a wall. General Dwight D. Eisenhower made a choice that changed the course of the war. He diverted every drop of available fuel to Field Marshal Montgomery in the north. George S. Patton received nothing. Patton refused to accept the order. He looked at his officers and spoke a line that became legend. "My men can eat their belts, but my tanks have got to have gas." This is the record of the Great Fuel Heist of 1944. It is the account of how America's most famous general became a thief to maintain his momentum. He deceived his superiors. He bypassed the chain of command. He watched as vital supplies vanished from Allied depots and reappeared in the tanks of the Third Army. To understand the crime, look at the map of August 1944. The breakout from Normandy was absolute. The grinding war in the hedgerows had ended. The Allied forces were finally mobile. Patton's Third Army led the charge. They moved faster than any military force in history, 20 miles a day, 40 miles a day, on some days 60. They liberated Paris, they crossed the Seine, they pursued the German Wehrmacht toward the borders of the Reich. But speed creates a logistical vacuum. A modern army is a machine that consumes gasoline. A Sherman tank travels 1 mile on 1 gallon of fuel. Patton commanded thousands of tanks. He commanded thousands of trucks and thousands of jeeps. Every 24 hours, the Third Army required 350,000 gallons of fuel just to idle and move. If they engaged the enemy, that requirement jumped to 450,000 gallons. The supply lines were failing. Fuel started at the Normandy beaches, hundreds of miles to the rear. The Red Ball Express, a massive truck convoy, operated 24 hours a day. Thousands of drivers pushed engines to the limit to reach the front lines. It was not enough. Then came the political interference. On August 29th, a crisis meeting convened at Supreme Headquarters. Eisenhower sat at the table. The decision was final. Priority went to the British. Patton was told to stop. But Patton did not stop. September 1944. General Dwight Eisenhower faced a logistical nightmare. He had two aggressive commanders moving toward the German border. Patton pushed from the south. Montgomery pushed from the north. But the Allied supply lines were stretching to the breaking point. There was not enough fuel to keep both armies moving. The logistics system was paralyzed. Thousands of trucks were stuck on ruined roads. Eisenhower had to choose one horse to win the race. Field Marshal Montgomery demanded the lead. He proposed a massive airborne and ground strike through Belgium and the Netherlands. He called it Operation Market Garden. Montgomery made a bold claim. One powerful thrust to Berlin would end the war by Christmas. But there was a condition. He required every drop of gasoline and every spare crate of ammunition. He demanded that Patton's Third Army come to a complete halt. Why did Eisenhower listen? The pressure of the alliance was heavy. He needed to keep the British and Americans working as one unit. Eisenhower signed the order. All supply priority went to the 21st Army Group in the north. Montgomery won the debate. For George Patton, the decision was a tactical disaster. He received the cable from headquarters. Third Army will halt. No fuel will be delivered until further notice. The scene at Patton's headquarters near Verdun was chaotic. The general did not just read the report, he threw it. He slammed his fist onto the wooden map table with enough force to rattle the room. He screamed at his staff. He called it a terrible mistake. The footage from the era shows Patton's restless energy. He knew the Germans were retreating in panic. They were broken and disorganized. "We are giving them a gift," Patton shouted. He believed that stopping now would allow the Wehrmacht to rebuild their defenses. He met with General Omar Bradley. Patton pleaded for 400,000 gallons of gasoline. He promised to be inside Germany within 48 hours. He claimed he could finish the conflict right then. But Bradley could not change the orders. Eisenhower's word was final. September 1944. Miles of American tanks sat motionless along the road to the Mosel River. Drivers sat on the cold steel hulls. They smoked cigarettes and stared toward the eastern horizon. The German army was retreating just out of reach, but the Third Army could not pursue. Why did the advance stop? It wasn't the German defense, it was a lack of fuel. General George S. Patton toured the Huidium. October 1944. George Patton faced a total halt because of dry fuel tanks. He decided to steal what he could not earn. The plan was audacious and technically criminal. Patton's intelligence officers located a massive fuel depot deep in the rear of the U.S. First Army. General Courtney Hodges commanded the First Army, and he also had orders to slow down. But Hodges had a stockpile. Hundreds of thousands of gallons of gasoline sat in jerry cans under heavy guard. How did Patton bypass his own allies? The answer was simple: deception. Patton assembled a provisional truck company immediately. He handpicked his toughest drivers for the task. He selected officers who knew how to lie without blinking. The orders were blunt. Soldiers removed all Third Army insignias from their uniforms. They ripped off their shoulder patches. Mechanics painted over the bumper codes on every vehicle. The forgery was professional. They created fake requisition papers. These documents claimed the fuel was for a Priority 1 mission. They forged the authorization of SHAF, the Supreme Headquarters. The convoy set out under the cover of rain and darkness. They drove north. The sound of heavy engines filled the night air. The trucks reached the military police checkpoints. When the guards asked for identification, the drivers lied. They claimed to be First Army supply units moving stock to a forward dump. The ruse worked. The MPs waved them through. The convoy reached the depot. Rows of thousands of fuel cans stretched into the distance. It was the lifeblood of the war effort. Patton's men began loading. They worked in silence and shadow. There was no turning back now.